going to build a freeway over us. My experience when I was 4 years old was that you don't really own the real estate that you live in. They'll pay you, but you know, we all live here under the acceptance of higher authority. And then when I was researching around here about when the Spanish came, the Indians didn't really think they owned land. They thought that the earth had its own spirit. They moved around more. They didn't think they owned land. Well, the Spanish come in and say, well, that's good that you don't think you own land because the king owns it. So we're going to have a road that goes through. It's going to be called El Camino Real, the King's Road. And the beach, yeah, Playa del Rey, beach of the king. And then, you know, they'd come up to California looking for gold. When they didn't find it, which was funny, because later on, it was here the whole time. But they continued on to go the other side of the Pacific to get the spices that Columbus had originally gone looking for. And he goes, his name was King Philip, he goes, I think I'll name this whole country the Philippines. Yeah. So after coming up the coast for 200 years, every month there would be a big old boat come lumbering down our coast that had started out in the Philippines and was doing the big arc and heading down to Acapulco to unload the spices and the treasure down there in Acapulco. They would load it, take it to Mexico City, do all the accounting, take it to Veracruz, load it back on a boat, and take that to Spain. And they'd conquered Peru and they were getting silver there, which the Chinese really liked. So they had a whole circle going. But what was interesting is they acted like they discovered the place. You know, we all went to school thinking that Columbus discovered it. But of course there have been people living here for at least 10,000 years. You know, if you think the pyramids about 3,000 years old, 7,000 years before the pyramids, there were a huge population here. I'm thrilled. It worked. So the people that lived here, though, you know, they hadn't discovered a grain that grew along the river that had many, many seeds in it. The most common variety of it that we know of is wheat. And so before wheat was discovered, it was impossible to have cities because you couldn't harvest all this food and store it to feed a big enough population. So everybody had to kind of wander the territory, hunting and gathering to survive. And you could never have really high density. You didn't have cities. But then the Tigris and the Euphrates, a couple of rivers that come together, they've discovered the grain there and the first cities are there. Well, what's amazing though is that 9,000 years earlier, or at least 7,000 years earlier, the best place to live on the planet, bar none, was here because we had a lot of fresh water rolling in out of the hills. We had this bountiful ocean and all kinds of plants and animals. So it was really perfect place to live. And they say of hunting and gathering populations, this was very possibly the largest on Earth, our basin. Yeah. And sometimes people say, well, where's their buildings? Where's theirs? The other thing that was going on 10,000 years ago was there was an ice age. And the ice age led to the sea level being much lower, so that our shoreline was 2 to maybe even 3 miles farther out. And all the islands were 2 miles wider on each side. So you were a hell of a lot closer to the islands, but it also meant through the next 10,000 years as that sea slowly was rising, it was covering up those areas where you had lived. So who knows? There might be some good things out there. But that's really what was happening, is that they were moving inland steadily. And there's still Chumash around here, you know, if you get a chance to go to any of their events, they have a wonderful solstice thing. They're very interesting. I started out, I had learned to surf at Topanga Beach, but I used to like to surf at the shore break. And when the Spanish came up there, they asked the Chumash, they called it the Bay of the Canoes because there were like 50 canoes there. And they said, so what do you call this area? And they said, well, this is where the waves sound loud. Wo is the water. So Humalawo means where the waves sound loud. And Topanya is the place above, because it's just slightly above the river. And so, there was lots of good things to eat around here. They hunted, they gathered. It was a very lush environment. And therefore, even though the Chumash and the Tongva were both very capable of having weapons, because they certainly had tools, and they never fought. And it's very interesting, because our European way is, well, so who owned it? Or who, no, it was such a lush environment. Typical Californians, they got along with each other. Oh, I don't want to skip Our Lady. Now, I've given her a name. She's Espiritu. That means hope. And what I like about her is she's industriously making a basket. And some of those baskets are so tightly woven that they can carry water in them. But the thing that really puts the picture over the top is her dog. And you notice there's all this talk about, is it fresh water, is it saltwater marshes, or whatever. You notice this hut here. It's made out of river reeds, not seaweed. But she's got some nice work there. And the laundry's drying on the roof, but that's okay. So you can't clearly see those names. But what's interesting about it is all the red are villages. Wow. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people lived here. And if you look at it even more in terms of the rivers, you usually wanted to live near a river, but slightly up from it. Because, just like today, there's times when it rains like hell, and that river rises and the whole area is a wetland. You've got to be a little higher up. And so you've got to be able to move quickly, but you also want to live close enough to where it's easy to get that fresh water. It's easy to... but you look at these villages, and I've gone over this map, because it's kind of interesting, because there are 3 distinct tribes that'll have villages right next to each other. They obviously got along. And there were 3 big villages here, because this was a particularly lush environment. Most of us think of canoes, it's like a big hollowed out log. They're heavy. They're hard to make. They're hard to maneuver. The Polynesians, who are the greatest sailors on Earth, not even close, Pacific, it laughs at the other oceans. It's so much bigger. And these people sailed the entire Pacific. And what's interesting is there's a current and winds that make a circle. So you can leave from some part of southern Mexico and kind of cruise along out there and maybe hit Hawaii, then hit the Philippines, then come up, do a little trading with the Japanese or the Chinese, then keep heading north, and then it starts to come across, and then you come south, right around Washington, Oregon, you come to the coast here. And so that cycle is ancient. And what's really fun is that this particular style of canoe is a sewn plank canoe. So it's much lighter. It's not a hollowed out log. They actually take these planks, bend them, make holes in them, sew them together. And so it's much lighter, stronger, faster, but it has a real design issue. And that is that what are you going to do to seal those cracks? When it's one big log, not a problem. But here you've got these huge cracks. So the only Indians in the United States that had this kind of canoe were the Chumash and the Tongva, because it turns out that these people got a lot of tar on their beaches. And they also have a big pit of it over here off of a street named the Tar, La Brea. And so they not only put that tar on their roofs, that can make a thatched cottage work, but they also, you can see it dripping down the seams of the tomo. The other thing, it's either a tomo or a tia. But what's interesting is tomo is only one consonant away from the Polynesian word for the same boat. And yet archaeologists will get in arguments about it. Oh no, it's not Polynesian. Really. All it does is look like one, called one. Yeah, but how did they get over there? How does anybody get over there? You head north, come around on down the coast. But there's one up at the UC, up at Santa Barbara Mission. There's one down in Palos Verdes. And if you get a chance to see one of these canoes, they're great. I mean, it's an amazing technology for how old it is. The Spanish come here first, looking for gold. How many of you know where California name comes from? Good, we got a couple of followers of Queen Califia. In 1542, they are looking for Queen Califia. The legend says she's a black Amazon, leader of the island of her kingdom. And Califia always wears gold armor and has gold weapons. So the Spanish come up the coast hoping to meet this lady and hoping to take her gold away. They get here, and of course they meet a lot of friendly Indians, which didn't do well for the Indians later, that they knew how friendly they were. But so they come up here and they land, and right away they're kind of looking for water. They're a little parched. And so the Indians very quickly show them where the springs are and share with them. And then they go, but, so where's Califia? And the Indians are kind of looking like, No Califia. But they ended up naming the Baja Peninsula Califia first, and then there was a Alta and a Lower. And so that's where the name comes from, Queen Califia. I love that. When I tell that, I sometimes give this abbreviated talk to the fourth graders. They love that. You know, and the other thing, some of them are in Santa Monica. I go, where did that get its name? St. Monica. Yeah, and apparently when the Spanish came through on a particularly parched day, they ended up at Uni High at the Tonga Spring, and it was on St. Monica's Day. St. Monica is famous for crying for her wicked son, Augustine, who later on has an epiphany and changes and turns out to be a pretty good saint, but he put her through hell. And so when they're up there getting this precious water, it's St. Monica's tears. And so they named the bay, the town, everything, the mountains, all named after St. Monica because of her wicked son. And of course there's St. Monica's in Santa Monica. There's also St. Augustine's in Culver City. Divided up into ranchos. They go, well, we can't seem to find anything valuable here, but we could have cattle here so that when our ships come around, we could pick up hides, we could pick up tallow. So if you want some land, they went down, at that point they had, most of their Mexicans had been there, you know, they mixed in with the Indians, they had brought some slaves over from Africa, interestingly enough, and so there were Africans in Mexico all the way back in like 1650, and they blended in, and they were accepted, and then later on, when the Spanish are worried that someone else, like the Russians or the French or the English, are going to take over California, they're going, you know what, we'll take the inner city from Mexico City and these other places, and we'll promise them land if they'll move up. So if you look at the old census, you'll see that it's mestizos and mulattos. Mulattos being half African. And that Pico family, what's nice is that they hung around long enough so we could get pictures. Definitely mulatto family. And so we were a blend early, and it always have been. So they divided it up in these ranchos that you didn't own. You only had the right to cattle on it. And in order to get one of these grants, you had to have 50 head of cattle. And so then, a lot of times it was a blacksmith who'd come up, or a soldier, and that's what happened here. They ended up giving this land to the Machados. And also, not being dumb guys, each of them said, okay, yeah, I'll raise your cattle for you, and it still belongs to the king, but make sure I have a creek, okay? I have to have fresh water. And so you'll see that all the ranchos, very carefully, have to have fresh water, a creek growing through it. And that map that I showed you before, they're all living on creeks. And down here, of course, the Boca de Santa Monica Rancho had to have the water coming down Santa Monica Canyon and the water coming down Topanga. The Sesti, the one in Malibu, had to have the river coming down in Malibu to Malibu Creek. This is what shows, what land they had the right to move this cattle on. And what's really sad here is that there were 3 villages here, quite beautiful villages, and they turned them into cattle yards. This area right here is called the Willow Grove. Those are all willow trees. And you can see where these 2 creeks come together. You're probably pretty familiar with those creeks coming down. And there was a really nice spring just up here. That's where their adobe ended up being. I love maps, but I also love when there's a little bit of art in there. And I've also had a long time argument with a friend of mine about whether the LA River actually ever came here. And he stubbornly says no. And I'm going, no, I've been on the Amazon before. Sometimes a river can be only this deep but miles wide. And look at that land, it's alluvium, and it's been, there's been water flowing in, and especially when it rains. Because I was in Culver City when I was a kid, when Sepulveda flooded. I mean, the fact is, this all floods. 38, everybody was under like 2 feet of water. So the fact is that it all floods, and what I love about this drawing is that it has the LA River coming from downtown. And also up here, and you can look at this little number code down below. At the bend, there's something called the Zanja, which is the ditch. And down in LA, it's called Zanja Madre, which means the mother ditch. And that was, all the irrigation came from that. And of course, it came this way too, for the times when it was drier and you wanted to divert some, get the citrus growing or whatever. Because this particular area, they quickly realized cattle isn't going to really cut it. We'll do what we can. But they grew grapes here, right here. And this was famous for white wine from Ballona. So, what I like about the Zanja being downtown is that I lived for a while in a part of Venice where there was the street Zanja. And then for a while I lived on the lake. And Marine used to be called Ballona because that's the edge of the rancho. So that whole area had water at different times, different places, I remember when they were working on the Penmar golf course and they had to dig it up and they were concerned they were going to be finding Indian stuff, but they mainly found Japanese stuff because that's who was growing the citrus and stuff there then. Here is that we have a little guy, and you can look at it on your own, hanging out here with a pick. 5 years before they found gold up at Sutter's Mill, this guy pulled an onion out of the hill, and in the roots was a nugget. And we did have some gold down here. Nothing like they did up there. But, yeah, the first gold in California was actually here. A little camp there for a while that all the local citizens could complain because once you have gold, you have all the bad behavior that comes with it. Look at this map on your own. I got one over there. It's so fun. And what was great about it is that LA Times brought this out in 1982. And it was supposed to reflect the 200 years of LA up to that point. And so this is from 1792 or 1782 until 1882. And so there's a lot of things on there that you don't see any other place. Like for instance, that little pier with the boat on it. Well, when there's a railroad that runs up to a little pier, the name for that is shoe fly. So you and I have been calling that the Santa Monica Pier for a while. It's the shoe fly pier. There's so much fun stuff in this, But, there's a place in San Pedro called Snake Island, and it's because whenever it floods around here, it was a place that all the snakes ended up. This shows, when you were getting around before cars, you had to go on the trains, and there were 2 stations that were prominent at the time. I've got another map that'll show in a minute, but Ala was up there, and Machada, they mispronounced Machado. But that's right in the marina now. And that train did something that was called a circle route. When people were coming to LA, they'd start in downtown and they'd do the circle route for $1, and they'd usually end up having lunch down here. This is the various names you recognize, and must have been after a pretty wet year. And any of you that are on Facebook with me know that I always love to have Saddle Peak in any of my pictures because that establishes where I am. All the world for me is measured in distance from Saddle Peak. I grew up down below it, but so we got Saddle Peak up there, and I really like dogs too. And here's this guy, and he says it's near Santa Monica. Yeah, it's kind of near Santa Monica, but guess what? It's not Santa Monica. There was a hunting lodge, of course, up here. Some of you old playa people know that there was a hunting lodge right on Culver. And the owner of it was Will Tell. Not only the Tongva and Chumash are getting around in their canoes and kind of controlling the territory, and then the Spanish come in, very quickly it becomes apparent to the powers that be that they want to have power in the Pacific, that there's going to be a military aspect of our little bay in our area. Because you got steady fresh water, you got access to everything. So early on, there were these plans that luckily never came to be. But of course, before World War II in the 30s, there was going to be an Air Force base, a Navy base, all right here in Playa. On old photos, they kind of pencil things in that are a little too faint, and that makes them seem a little too close, because that's supposed to be like the area above Topanga in the distance, or the Palisades. It's looking way too close, whereas this photo part down here is actually pretty accurate. And that's where Culver comes down, like Tanner's would be right in there. There were so many people that lived here. If you were Indian when the United States took over, all Mexicans instantly became citizens and could vote. In 1850. Indians didn't get the vote until 1924, 74 years later, and 4 years after women. So a lot of the Indians that lived here called themselves Mexicans. As the area became more successful, other people moved in, and it became a prominent place. But there was still a native population here that had been here at the schools and been working here in the fields. But I love this old Ballona school. Playa del Rey, the new city of pleasure, its lagoons and glittering breakers, the beach of the king, to be veined by waterways and aglow with lights. They're promising some electricity here. And no mention at all of Hyperion or anything else. But this is actually 2 different photos. So that one's clearly recognizable that we're looking across to Topanga, and this one is a little bit at an angle, and they put them together to kind of give you the idea, but it's a little misleading. You've got old black and whites, and it's not reproducing well. You go at it with the pencil. I've got other picture later where it's tinting, and they take liberties. I love this place. So this is 1910. They come here and decide to build what was a design had been for bicycle racing, and then motorcycles started racing on this in like the 1880s, 1890. And so when it came time to race cars, they thought, well, we'll just make it heavier. We'll just make it bigger. So this is almost a mile long, no straightaways, all made out of wood. They called them splinter tracks. and Barney Oldfield, who was the Mario Andretti of his time or whatever, better than Mario. Anyway, he set world records in this oval, in this pie pan, they called it, totally round track. He set records here that weren't beaten until they opened Indianapolis, which is like 2.5 miles long and has straightaways. But this was the world record setting track, and it was only here from 1910 until 1913. But what I like about it is that wonderful wetlands going in the distance, and over there past Zanja, past, I mean, that little town there, that's Venice. Venice at this point was 5 years old. They were just sort of deciding what they were going to do to make money. And this area along here, as it turned out, if you're not on the Ballona and getting the fresh water there, if you drop a well in down there a little more, you might not get fresh water. You might not even get salt water. You're going to get the black gold. 1910, they were just starting with the cars. They were just starting. They were going, okay, well, can we light lights with it? What can we do with it? Oh, okay. But I like that it's the yellow car, and those tracks are on old maps, so we know exactly where they came. And this is Jefferson going by. There's some areas in here that were obviously marked off for the crops. But everywhere where you see the blue, I mean, that area is pretty much all wet right then. So there was a recreational gun club, and there's that Ala station I was promising you. And what's really fun is that if you follow that down, if you're on Lincoln Boulevard in front of the Toyota dealership, there's still tracks there, iron tracks. I don't know if it's to keep the right-of-way or what, but they must have rebuilt Lincoln 20 times since, but those tracks always remain there. And they cross Lincoln to this day. We got Speedway. It says Motordrome there, because the Motordrome was actually right here. They had the recreational gun club, and a lot of us in the marina that are given a hard time about our boats polluting or whatever, and you go, okay, when you guys have a shooting range and stuff, how many million rounds of lead do you think you pumped into those hills? Be a nice place to live, huh? So this is the other school. And they're looking more like the people that were here 10,000 years, because they were still here. And that back there is not an oil derrick. That's a water tower, because the people that lived down here, because the ocean would come up and bump into it, wasn't dependable for that. So everybody that could have a tank on a tower was getting it from the Centinela Spring. And so that aquifer there has always been really important to the people down here, and still should be. The people that are up there that ever think of like draining that area or draining the aquifer out of there, lay off our water. This is kind of fun because I know people in all those areas. And there's Tanner's, Toes Beach, which was a great left. You surfer guys remember that. It's a nice tree, huh? 200-300 years old. Some towers in the background. Does it say Spence down here? You know?
Spence is a photographer that went up in his airplane and took all the Spence collection that they keep over at UCLA. And yeah, we have used a lot of his photographs for our work. He did it every year.
Yes, Spence did this one too.
I think so. There he is.
There, it's still there. And there's some looming giants on the horizon. In the 20s, as the population had gotten more in Venice, they didn't have enough water there. All they had was this black gold. And so Venice, which had been an independent city and had owned all the way to Imperial Highway, all of this was Venice Post Office, where we are. Playa, Venice Post Office. But in the 20s, they really ran out of water. And they had tons of oil. And they said, LA, come on, sell us some water. No, we think that you should join us again. You should become part of LA. So if you're ever driving down Washington, you wonder why LAPD is on that side, the sheriffs are on this side. Venice had to give itself back to LA in the 20s in order to get water from Mar Vista wells, because it's always been about the water. Still is about the water. But I love the streetcar, and I mean, look at all those oil wells. Ridgefield, and there's some places in Culver City that still have those street lamps. And what was amazing is that it was a time when movies were booming, and so a lot of movie stars wanted to be in, you know, they always want to be in trendy investments at the same time. They don't all just do it with real estate. So they were buying oil wells. So the one that's still pumping gas, because they pumped all that gas into it in Playa, is called Vidor 18. That's because it's King Vidor. He got his start out in the Palisades at Innsville and was a director and a very talented guy, but one of his investments was a little oil well there. And you know, that actually happened a lot, where movie people had an oil well or two. Yeah, this peninsula, pretty expensive these days, considering that there's all that oil there. So this actually says Marina del Rey on it, but of course it's before they built it. One of the times I superimposed a picture, a Google picture of where my dock is, where my boat is, and one of these wells is right under my boat. Okay, so one of the things they wanted to do is try and control the flooding, and so in the 30s, in 38 in particular, we had this incredible flood. Now, there had been a flood earlier. A famous one was in 1825, and that's the one where the LA River got kind of spunky and joined up and headed to San Pedro instead of having that little piece that came out here. So we continued to get the runoff from all these countless creeks, but after 1825, 1826, most of the water from the LA River is going down to Pedro. They got into this thing about controlling nature, and they ended up doing this all over town, just like that. I had a friend who, Jumpin' Bill Heskamp, some of you might know him. He was a paratrooper in the Vietnam War. Still can't talk about some of the places he jumped into, but anyway, on the 4th of July, about 20 some years ago, he was parachuting into the back of the Prince of Wales with flares. And he accidentally, when he landed, started a little fire. And the fire department was there and everything. They put it out really quickly. But there have been a history of fires getting started that are very hard to put out. And there's one, I was hunting frantically for pictures of it because I have seen pictures before where it burned for almost a week. And later on, the gas company, when they bought up these old fields, they said, you know, it's a really nice place for us to store gas as well. So they have been pumping gas into these old areas underground. And yes, it does create the methane to come bubbling up and all that, but it's really cheap. Unless you're, like, say at a place called Aliso out in the valley, where it starts to leak and it's really serious trouble. This here was an accidental. They had not planned this. And this was, I think, 2013, about 5 years ago. But actually, there's, you know, people that live around there sometimes smell it. The fact is that they put in, there's the existing oil under there. They put in billions with a B, BTUs of gas under pressure. And when I asked them about the King Vidor, I'm going, Vidor 18, why do you keep that going, just to maintain your rights? No, we have to relieve the pressure. This is a little more recent, and Espiritu, who used to make the baskets and all of that, somebody took over her spot. I don't think they're making as good baskets. I don't see the dog. I'm not too happy when when these old places are lived in like this. A little reminder of what went on for about 10,000 years here. And what's interesting is that if you look at it geologically and the sea is rising again, we really have to defend that fresh water as far as we can. We don't want to encourage the ocean coming in. We want to defend our fresh water, and that's really a right, and it's really important to all the other beautiful things that live here. And so, he's looking at you.
Use the water from Sentinella Springs. Is that the one in Inglewood? The Sentinella?
Yeah, it depends how you count Englewood, but yeah. You've been up to the Adobe up there. Yeah.
I think so.
That's there because there's a wonderful spring there, and it's always come down the hill. And I mean, when you're having to make do with a cattle ranch, you know, you're not doing well in that time. So they very quickly, a lot of them, the guys in Malibu, Reyes, grew wine. The guys out at the Mission in San Fernando, everybody started going, well, we can make brandy out of this too. We can, and so the fact is that they went to crops that were better cash crops. So if you had a lot of water like we did around here, you know, you're getting bean fields, you're getting all kinds of, I mean, Santa Monica used to be a big bean field before aerospace. So the fact is that these people were all doing the best they could with the resources that were available. But yes, Sentinella Spring is the one. Yes?
Yeah, I lived in Inglewood. Still live in Inglewood now.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
In the railroad tracks, the olive tracks that go through the east end of Ballona wetlands, it crossed the Ballona Creek and went up through Hughes into Inglewood. And there was a street in Inglewood, Ballona Street, where I lived. And we lived along the railroad tracks where there were probably farm buildings, like there may have been. So where Sentinella Creek went through, that was in Inglewood, and went towards where the freeway is, that's where the Adobe were. So there was a street called Ballona Street and Meadowbrook in Inglewood. There was a train station which was the terminus of the Inglewood branch line, which is that line that runs
You know what the little town there was called?
No.
It's something like, I'll think of it later. The fact is, it's kind of funny because there's still a street there with that name. And it's not Mercy, something with an M. But that they were realizing that they were going to have to go farther east. And of course, Culver shows up, who was the head of the National, or the California Association of Realtors. And he didn't have any jobs there. And Ince, who later on built the studios, was making silent westerns out in the Palisades. And so he needed a creek, and they weren't flowing that good over there. So he came over to Ballona, and he brought his Indians, real Indians, who lived in the Palisades at the time. But it was called Innsville. He came up there, and Culver came down and said, "What are you guys doing here?" He said, "We're making a movie." And he goes, "How about Ince? How about if I give you a really great deal on some land right up here in Culver City? You could build a studio, and I would support you with it. And because eventually you're going to get tired of making these little westerns out on the creek." So, of course, Ince does go up to Culver City, and he started all the studios up there. But there had been a little, not a horse ranch, but a stables area where you could get horses. And later on, the back lot, MGM and all that, came out of that area. Culver City, where Hollywood movies are made.
One of the builders of Marina del Rey, proponent, a very strong guy. His father was a Western actor, Bill Hart, and there's and Bill Hart Jr. helped build this place, and his son is still around here somewhere.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so they had boats, and they were involved from the very beginning in transforming this into the marina.
So the guy that named that little town, his name was Mesmer,
Yeah,
like mesmerize. And so the little town was called Mesmer.
Oh, great.
But, you know, anybody who lives near there, I mean, the water is a significant part of the character of living there. Then we come up with these unnatural rivers of cars that we suspend over everything that has such a negative impact in general. If you look back at these old pictures where we've got an electric train system, the biggest in the world, the best in the world, and these natural creeks, and instead of that, they tear down my little house on Huntley Avenue.
When did Howard move into town? Howard, you.
Howard, it's kind of interesting because there was an old, Ince himself was into planes, and they had an air show, I think it was in 1910, and Hearst went to it, and Ince went to it, and all the just about to be movie people, it isn't happening really yet. They all go down there and they see all these planes in Dominguez, and they're just mystified, and it's wonderful. And Ince says, well, you know, there's this boulevard that runs right down, straight road, and it has the offshore wind. Venice Boulevard, right where it crosses Abbot Kinney, was Ince Field. And all the stunt pilots, I mentioned earlier about the World War I surplus planes, you could buy a Jenny for $1,000. That's why they were crashing them into barns and doing all those stunts, because they were cheap. And everybody that went to the movies after World War I, they wanted to see airplanes. So even it had nothing to do with the plot. There's an airplane in there somewhere. And they were all flying out of Ince Field. And there's a book that was a novel that was thinly disguised story of when he came out here, when Hughes came out here, because he was really into flying. And he used to fly out of Ince Field all the time. So later on, when he builds the biggest airplane in the world, also maybe one of the biggest boondoggles, but the biggest planes in the world, he builds the longest runway in the world here with the prevailing air coming off the ocean, the idea that, you know, with that long runway and with some prevailing wind, we'll be able to even get this huge thing off. And at that time, he owned from Sepulveda to the Sand. This whole area was owned by Howard Hughes. And my dad did a remodel for one of Howard Hughes' girlfriends in the early 50s. And I remember him coming home, and I'm like 3, 4 years old, and going, Daddy, Daddy, yay. You know, as he comes up, and all of a sudden there's this sedan behind him with these guys all wearing fedoras. And I go, Dad, who are those guys? Damn Mormon detectives work for Hughes. The time while he was working on Hughes' girlfriend's place, Howard had him tailed the whole time. Little personal side there. Not much to do with water.
You have the original LAX. There was a guy named McGrath and a fellow from the Santa Monica area named Auden Bay, and they bought used World War I planes, and they used to have to take the fence down because where LAX is now, that was cows. You mentioned the cow fields.
Yeah.
And they had to take the fences down in order to take off and land.
Yeah.
And then Alan McGrath became the father of LAX.
And what was kind of interesting about that place is Standard Oil had some luck out here. Their first El Primero was up in Richmond, California. And then the number 2 well, which was a real gusher, not El Primero, but El Segundo, the second one, was down here. And at the time, they were making deals with the Saudis for sending their engineers there to get the Saudi oil production going. And so the engineers from El Segundo were having to fly to Saudi Arabia, leapfrogging across the United States in these little planes. So there's pictures of Mines Field, which was their little airport, quonset that say Standard Oil on them. And of course, Mines Field became LAX.
Crazy.
Also not about water.
Liquid gold.
Any other questions? Well, why don't we have some water? Thank you.
Thank you.